December 1954, the Harvard College Observatory in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Snow on the dome, the brass refractor inside it dark and cold.
In a side room off the main floor, a 40-year-old astronomer named James Gilbert Baker sits at a drafting table that should be tracking comets. It is covered in tracings for a lens. The lens is longer than his arm. He is calculating the math for a camera that, if it works, will resolve a 2.5-foot object from 65,000 feet, higher than any aircraft had ever flown. The drawings on his desk are not for a telescope. They are for a weapon system that does not yet exist, attached to an aircraft that has not yet flown, run by an agency that does not yet have a name for the program. The agency is the Central Intelligence Agency. They'd given him 8 months. Baker had never been to the Soviet Union. He has been told nothing about what his lens is going to photograph. He has been told the altitude. He has been told the resolution. He has been told the deadline. That is all. James Gilbert Baker was born in Louisville, Kentucky on the 6th of November, 1914. He had earned his doctorate in astronomy from Harvard in 1942 with a dissertation on the optical correctors that still bear his name. He had spent the war designing aerial reconnaissance cameras for the United States Army Air Forces, the K-19, the K-22, the K-38, glass that flew over Germany, that photographed the Ruhr industrial belt from 25,000 feet, that helped Allied bomber crews find what was left of the bridges and rail yards after the previous day's strike. He had won the Bond Award of the Astronomical Society of the Pacific in 1947 for astronomical optics work that had nothing to do with weapons. He was, in the Cambridge of 1954, a quiet figure, a man whose name was known to a few hundred professional astronomers and to a smaller circle of people inside the American military who had read his classified reports on aerial camera design. He held more than 50 patents. He had been, according to the Optical Society, the first person to use an electronic computer to calculate the design of an optical lens. He was 40 years old. He could pick out the Andromeda galaxy with the naked eye on a clear night, which was a skill no one in Washington cared about.
In the spring of that year, a panel of American scientists had been convened in secret under James R. Killian, the president of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The panel was asked to find a way to look at the Soviet Union from the air without being shot down. Edwin Land, the founder of the Polaroid Corporation, served on the panel. Land knew Baker by reputation. He had read Baker's reconnaissance camera papers from the war. Around the table with Land sat the head of MIT's radar laboratory, a former president of Bell Labs, a Nobel laureate in chemistry, and the man who would later run the American Apollo program. They were called the Technological Capabilities Panel. They had 18 months to tell President Eisenhower how to win a war they could not see.
The panel reported to Eisenhower in the autumn. On the 5th of November, 1954, the program was approved. On the 9th of December, the Central Intelligence Agency signed a $22.5 million contract with Kelly Johnson's Skunk Works at Lockheed for an aircraft. By way of Edwin Land, the work on the lens went to Cambridge. The aircraft was being designed around Baker's lens, not the other way around. The man at the drafting table did not know this. He had been told what to deliver and how long he had. By December of 1954, the United States Air Force was telling Congress that the Soviet Union would soon have a strategic bomber fleet large enough to reach every major American city. The estimates were rising every quarter. The estimates would, in a matter of months, become known in Washington as the Bomber Gap. The man at the drafting table had not read those estimates. He had not been told that the photographs his lens was being built to take were going to settle whether the Soviet bomber threat was real or invented. He had not been told that the United States Air Force would soon be building those bombers' American counterpart, 744 of them, on the strength of estimates he had not seen. July 1955. The Soviet Aviation Day demonstration at the Tushino airfield outside Moscow. Khrushchev on the reviewing stand, Western military attachés in the diplomatic box with binoculars and notebooks, counting. A formation of 10 Myasishchev M4 Bisons crosses the airfield from south to north. The attachés write down 10. The formation passes out of sight. The formation turns. The formation comes back with 8 more aircraft in front. The attachés write down 8 more. The combined number in their notebooks is 28. There were 10 aircraft. The other 18 were the same 10, flying in figure eights behind the horizon, doubling back for a second pass. The Soviet Air Force did not have 28 Bisons in operational service. They had 10. The bomber that was supposed to be the centerpiece of a strategic fleet capable of striking the American mainland existed in July of 1955, in single digits.
The man who had designed the Bison knew this. His name was Vladimir Mikhailovich Myasishchev. He had built the bomber to a requirement set by Stalin in 1951. A 4-engine jet aircraft that could reach the continental United States from Soviet airfields and return. Myasishchev's own performance tables, classified inside the OKB-23 Design Bureau, showed that the bomber could not. The fuel burn was too high. The airframe could not carry enough fuel. The combat radius with a normal 9,000-kilogram bomb load came in around 5,600 kilometers. The flight from Severomorsk to New York and back was roughly 12,000 kilometers. Khrushchev had inherited the Bison program from Stalin in 1953. The range problem had been known inside the Soviet Defense Ministry since the prototypes of 1952. Myasishchev had asked for a longer fuselage. He had asked for higher capacity fuel tanks. He had asked for a different engine. The political climate in Moscow after Stalin's death did not favor admitting that the United States could not be reached by Soviet bombers. The threat had to be credible. The threat was the leverage. The leverage was the negotiating table. The reports went back to London, to Washington, to NATO headquarters in Brussels. The estimate that the Soviet Union had 28 operational jet strategic bombers in July of 1955 became the basis for projection. If they had 28 by mid-1955, they would have at least 60 by 1956. They would have 200 by 1958. By 1960, the United States Air Force projected, they would have at least 800 strategic jet bombers ready to strike the American mainland. The projection had a name. It was called the Bomber Gap. The man pushing the projection hardest inside the United States Air Force was General Curtis LeMay. LeMay had commanded the Strategic Air Command since 1948. He had commanded the firebombing campaign over Japan in the spring of 1945, which had killed more Japanese civilians than the 2 atomic bombs combined. He believed in the depth of his bones that the Soviet Union would attack the United States the moment it had the means. He believed the means was now coming. In February of 1956, LeMay testified before a Senate Armed Services Subcommittee chaired by Senator Stuart Symington of Missouri. Symington had been the first Secretary of the Air Force. The testimony told the American public that the Soviet Union would, by 1959, have enough jet bombers to launch a first strike that would cripple the United States within 24 hours. LeMay told Congress that SAC needed more bombers. SAC needed more bases. SAC needed a faster, longer-ranged jet aircraft. The aircraft he wanted was the Boeing B-52 Stratofortress. The first B-52A had flown in August of 1954. By the end of 1955, the first production B-52Bs were operational. By 1956, the Air Force was authorizing a fleet of more than 400. By 1962, the United States would build 744 B-52s. The actual Soviet heavy bomber force, by 1960, would peak at around 170 aircraft. By 1962, the year the last B-52 rolled off the line in Wichita, the entire Soviet strategic bomber inventory, M4s and T-95s combined, would not exceed 250. The United States built 4 times as many strategic bombers as the country it was supposed to be racing. Eisenhower, in the White House, was skeptical.
He had spent 35 years in uniform. He had seen the intelligence community get force strength estimates wrong before. He had also seen the political cost of being right about that and saying so out loud. He authorized the B-52 expansion anyway. He pushed for a different way to count what the Soviets actually had.
That other way was the Technological Capabilities Panel under James Killian. The panel had been running through 1954. By the autumn, it had reported. By the 5th of November, it had been approved. By December, the Central Intelligence Agency had a contract with Lockheed for an aircraft, and a contract through Edwin Land for a camera. The panel's classified report named the strategic intelligence gap as the most dangerous element in the United States Cold War posture. It recommended a high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft. It recommended a survivable second strike force. It recommended satellite reconnaissance once the technology matured. By the time the report reached Eisenhower's desk in October, every recommendation had a budget line. The aircraft and the camera were the first to move. Land understood that there was no point building an aircraft that flew above Soviet interceptors if the camera inside it could not photograph what it saw. The resolution had to be enough to count individual aircraft on a parking ramp from the edge of the stratosphere. That requirement was beyond anything any reconnaissance camera had ever delivered. It required a lens that did not yet exist, in glass that did not yet exist, on an aircraft that did not yet exist.
Land had known Baker since the war years. He believed Baker was the only American optical designer with the combination of theoretical depth and practical aerial reconnaissance experience to deliver what the panel needed. The Central Intelligence Agency took his recommendation. The contract went to Cambridge in December. The lens Baker designed was longer than a man's arm. By the aerial reconnaissance standards of the day, it was enormous. The largest aerial cameras then in service used lenses with focal lengths in the range of 6 to 12 inches. Baker's lens was 3 times that. The longer the focal length, the more glass it required, and the more sensitive that glass became to temperature. At the operating altitude of the aircraft Lockheed was designing, the air outside the camera bay would be roughly 60 degrees below zero. The glass would have to perform without warping, without contracting unevenly, without losing focus across that gradient. Baker, in his classified reports to the Central Intelligence Agency through 1955, specified the formulations himself. He designed 2 cameras, one to see wide, one to see sharp.
The glass had to come from a single melt. The optical surfaces had to be polished to a uniformity the optical industry of 1955 had never attempted at this scale. Baker specified the suppliers, he specified the tolerances. He stayed personally responsible for every element of the optical train. The aircraft was being shaped to carry the cameras. Kelly Johnson's design team at the Lockheed plant in Burbank, California, drew an airframe so light it was effectively a glider with an engine bolted on, 80-foot wingspan, single engine, operating ceiling beyond anything the Soviet air defenses could reach. The plane existed to carry the camera. By the spring of 1955, the airframe had a serial number. By the summer, parts were being trucked across the desert to a dry lake bed in Nevada. By the 1st of August, the airplane flew. The test pilot was Tony LeVere, a Lockheed contract pilot who had flown the P-80 and the F-104. LeVere nursed the aircraft into the air for the first time on the first day of August 1955. By the autumn, it was reaching the altitudes Baker had been told to design for. The lens was still being polished. By the late summer of 1955, the first complete optical assembly had been crated and shipped from Cambridge. It would be married to the camera body. It would be installed in the camera bay of the aircraft that had been built to carry it. The aircraft flew. The lens flew with it.
The 4th of July, 1956. Just past dawn local time, over the Baltic Sea. A black-painted aircraft is climbing through 55,000 feet. The pilot is a 34-year-old American named Hervey Stockman. He is wearing a partial pressure suit, the first generation of high-altitude pressure suits the United States has ever issued. Below him, a Soviet radar operator on the Baltic coast sees a return at the edge of his screen. calls it in to district headquarters, watches it move east-northeast at speeds and altitudes his interceptors cannot match. Stockman has been told to fly across the Baltic, cross into Soviet airspace, head for Leningrad, then turn south. The aircraft above him will not be intercepted. The aircraft above him will not be shot down. The aircraft above him is, at the moment Stockman pushes the throttle forward at 65,000 feet, the highest flying aircraft anywhere in the world. In its belly is a lens designed at Harvard by James Gilbert Baker.
Stockman had flown P-51 Mustangs over Germany with the 357th Fighter Group. He had been one of Chuck Yeager's squadron mates. He had been recruited into the program in 1955 as a civilian. He had signed the paperwork that resigned his Air Force commission so the United States could deny he existed if he was shot down. The aircraft was new. The pressure suit was new. The route was new. The pilots had been training for 6 months at Watertown Strip in Nevada, learning to fly at altitudes where the human body cannot survive an unpressurized exposure of more than a few seconds. They had been told to memorize their routes. They had been told there were no second chances on a mission. They had been told that if the engine flamed out at altitude, they would have to descend through Soviet airspace to relight. They had been told that if they could not relight, they would have to bail out. They had been told that if they bailed out, they would be a civilian in a black flight suit in the middle of the Soviet Union with no identification and no diplomatic cover.
Stockman flew east. Below him, MiG interceptors scrambled out of bases at the Baltic coast. Then Karelia, then the Moscow military district. They climbed. They reached 50,000 feet. Then 55,000, then began to mush. They could not catch him. Their cannons could not reach him. Their air-to-air missiles, the early Soviet generation, could not lock him. He was 9 miles above them, and they were running out of climb. Over Leningrad, at the planned camera-on point, Stockman activated the system in the camera bay. Baker's lens, mounted in its housing at the bottom of the aircraft, opened on the city below. The shutter cycled. Film advanced. The shutter cycled again. 3 rolls of 9.5-inch wide film, more than a mile of film total, would pass in front of Baker's optics during the course of the mission. The aircraft turned south. It flew over the Soviet bomber bases that the Western intelligence estimates had been counting at a distance for 6 years. It photographed parking ramps. It photographed hangars. It photographed the dispersal patterns of operational squadrons. It photographed the runways. It photographed what was actually there.
At one main long-range aviation base after another, Stockman's lens captured a small handful of aircraft on the ground. At another, the dispersal contained only 2 4-piston bombers, Soviet copies of the American B-29, 15 years out of date. There were not enough strategic bombers on the ground for the bomber gap to be physically real. Stockman descended over Wiesbaden, West Germany, at the end of nearly 9 hours of flight. He had crossed 2,000 miles of Soviet airspace. He had photographed targets the Pentagon had been trying to see for the entire decade. He had not been shot at, because nothing the Soviets had could reach him. The aircraft taxied off the runway. Ground crews moved fast. The camera was unbolted from the airframe. The film canisters were removed, sealed, placed in a courier pouch. The courier pouch went on a transport aircraft within the hour. By the next morning, the film was at Stewart Photo Lab on 5th Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., a converted Ford dealership that had been turned into the photo interpretation facility of the Central Intelligence Agency. The man waiting for it was Arthur Lundahl.
Lundahl was a 41-year-old former Navy photographic intelligence officer with a master's degree in geology from the University of Chicago. He had spent the war reading photographs of Japanese airfields in the Pacific. He had joined the Central Intelligence Agency in 1953 to run a small photo interpretation cell. He had never seen anything like what was about to come off the developer. The negatives ran 9.5 inches wide. They were sharper than anything he had ever interpreted. He could see the individual aircraft on Soviet parking ramps. He could see whether their access panels were open or closed. He could see the shadows of fuel trucks beside them. He could count. His team worked beside him. The film was sharper than anything he had ever interpreted in 15 years of photographic intelligence. He could count, on a single negative, more aircraft than the entire American intelligence community had been able to identify on the ground in the Soviet Union since the end of the war. On Lundahl's light table,
Baker's glass was merciless.
The photographs of the first deep overflight showed a Soviet bomber force concentrated at fewer bases than the Pentagon had feared. A handful of M4 Bisons at the main strategic aviation airfield, a handful of Tu-95 Bears at others. Many fewer aircraft than the projections had predicted, many fewer aircraft than the bomber gap thesis had required to be there. The estimate the Western attachés had built off the Tushino flypast a year earlier was, in front of Lundal on a light table in Washington, falling apart. Men like Baker didn't fight for headlines. He spent the better part of a year at a drafting table in Cambridge, while the Pentagon spent billions of dollars building a bomber fleet to outpace a Soviet bomber fleet that did not exist. He never got a public profile. Most Americans have never heard his name. If you think the engineer who designed the camera that killed an entire decade of Pentagon panic deserves to be remembered, hit the like button. It helps keep the men who actually built the work in front of people who care about getting the history right.
It would take months for the interpretation to filter through the system. It would take more than a year for the formal national intelligence estimate to incorporate what the U-2 was showing. It would never reverse the B-52 expansion.
The film from the 4th of July overflight was followed through the summer and autumn of 1956 and into 1957 by film from many more deep penetration missions. Baker's lens, mounted in U-2 airframes flying out of Wiesbaden in Germany and Adana in Turkey, photographed every major Soviet long-range aviation base. By the autumn of 1957, the Central Intelligence Agency had assembled a comprehensive count. The Soviet strategic bomber force was a fraction of what the United States Air Force had been projecting. The 800 jet bombers by 1960 estimate was not just wrong, it was wrong by an order of magnitude. Eisenhower was briefed. He had been right to be skeptical. He had been right about the intelligence community. He had been right about the projection. The corrected estimate was issued by the United States Intelligence Board as a formal national intelligence estimate, classified top secret, distributed in revised form through 1957 and 1958. The Air Force did not reverse the B-52 expansion.
The contracts had already been signed. The factories were already in production. The bases were already being constructed in Maine, in Texas, in Spain, in Morocco. The crews were already being trained at McConnell. To stop the program in 1957 would have required the Air Force to admit, in front of Congress and the American public, that an entire decade of testimony, requirements documents, supplemental appropriations, and procurement decisions had been based on intelligence estimates that the Central Intelligence Agency now demonstrated were wrong. The Air Force did not admit it. Stuart Symington, the senator who had presided over the 1956 hearings, did not admit it either. The hearings had launched him as a presidential candidate. The press that had repeated his warnings did not retract them. The journalists who had built careers on the bomber gap thesis did not write the follow-up pieces. The Air Force adjusted the rationale instead. The B-52 was no longer needed to counter the bomber gap. The B-52 was now needed to counter the missile gap. The missile gap in early 1957 was new. It was being projected from Soviet ballistic missile tests that had begun the previous summer. By 1959, the missile gap would replace the bomber gap as the threat that justified the bomber fleet that was already in the air. The math changed. The budgets did not. James Gilbert Baker, in the autumn of 1957, was not at the drafting table in Cambridge anymore. He had finished the U-2 lens. He had been brought in to the next program. The next program was satellite reconnaissance. The Central Intelligence Agency had been planning, in parallel with the U-2, for an orbital system that would not depend on a manned aircraft to overfly Soviet airspace. Baker designed the optics for the early satellites in collaboration with the ITEC Corporation of Lexington, Massachusetts, an optical design firm founded in 1957 specifically to handle the work the Central Intelligence Agency was generating. The program was called Corona. The first successful Corona mission flew in August of 1960, returning film from orbit by parachute,
photographed by a Baker-designed optical system. Corona flew 144 missions between 1959 and 1972.
After Corona came Gambit. After Gambit came Hexagon. Baker designed the optics for each of them. Every national intelligence estimate of the Soviet strategic threat between 1960 and 1986 incorporated photography that traced back in the optical design heritage to the lens Baker had built at Harvard in 1954. The resolution Baker had delivered for the U-2, a 2.5-foot object from 65,000 feet, was the resolution against which every subsequent American reconnaissance system was measured. Corona improved on it. Gambit improved on Corona. By the mid-1970s, the resolution of American satellite optics was better than anything Baker had projected on his drafting table in 1954. Every step of that improvement had been calculated, originally, by a man who could pick out the Andromeda Galaxy with the naked eye on a clear night. James Gilbert Baker died on June 29, 2005, at his home in Bedford, New Hampshire. He was 90 years old. His optical design papers were still being taught in graduate seminars in Europe and the United States. His obituary in the New York Times described him as an astronomer. It did not mention the U-2, it did not mention Corona, it did not mention that the photographs that had ended the bomber gap and the missile gap and the Cuban Missile Crisis had come back through glass he designed. Kelly Johnson, who had designed the airframe that carried Baker's lens, had died in 1990. There were biographies of Kelly Johnson. There were museums named for Kelly Johnson. There were television specials about Kelly Johnson and the Skunk Works. There were no biographies of James Gilbert Baker. By the time Baker died, the United States had been through the bomber gap, the missile gap, the ABM gap, the spending gap, and the conventional force gap. Each one had inflated a Soviet capability beyond what the photographic intelligence showed it to be. Each one had driven a defense procurement decision. Each one had survived its own correction. The math kept changing. The budgets did not. If your father, grandfather, or uncle served during the Cold War, what unit, what airframe, what years, what theatre, he carried something that only exists now in the people who heard him tell it. Leave it in the comments. One name, one unit, one thing he told you that you've never heard anywhere else. The men who were there are almost all gone. Their stories go with them if no one writes them down.
The bomber gap was not a Soviet superweapon. It was a propaganda flypast. 10 aircraft, recycled past a reviewing stand at Tushino on a summer afternoon in 1955, counted as 28. It was broken by optical glass, not by diplomacy, not by generalship, not by the men with stars on their shoulders, by the glass. Vladimir Mikhailovich Myasishchev built the bomber that became the Bluff. He died in 1978 in Moscow. His own range tables had told him since 1952 that his airplane could not do what the parade said it could. The Soviet engine designers who could not beat the fuel burn, their names are scattered across a dozen design bureaus. The Pentagon never had to know them.
William McFadden built the camera body. He died unknown. Hervey Stockman flew the camera over the target on the 4th of July, 1956. He was shot down over North Vietnam 11 years later and spent 5 years and 10 months as a prisoner of war at the Hanoi Hilton. He died in 2007. Arthur Lundahl read what the glass captured. He later briefed Kennedy on the Soviet missiles in Cuba. He died in 1992. James Gilbert Baker built the glass.